Welcome to Cornerstone Home Inspection Education Center. Tonight we have a continuing education and a webinar presented by Carrie from Absolute Tank, who is going to be talking about tank testing, removal, and everything related to that. So I'm going to hand it over to Carrie. If you can, mute your speakers. If you have a question, unmute, or you can type in the chat box. Thank you very much. Carrie, take it away.
All righty. So some of you were just on a little before, but my name is Carrie Pinelli, and I am one of the owners of Absolute Tank Testing. And like many of you small business owners, you're also the manager, the HR department, the IT department, payables, receivables, you name it. But in any case, my business partner is my husband, Dave. And we started this business back in 1995, about a year before we got married. And the reason that we started this business together is while we were dating, we had spent every weekend traveling to either Cape Cod or to Vermont in the wintertime, because we both love water sports and snow sports. And even though we had different careers at the time, my husband ran a insurance agency and had a background in financial planning, and I was working as a paraprofessional at Easter Seals Rehab Center in New Haven with developmentally disabled children and adults. But in any case, on our drives, we were like, oh my God, wouldn't this be so much fun if we could find a business where we could work together and be able to work and live maybe in the places where we like to have fun. So at one point, one of Dave's really good friends, who was a service manager at a big fuel oil company in Bridgeport, told Dave that that this company had purchased or invested in this new tank testing methodology, and that they had the license for the state of Connecticut, but the rest of New England was open. So he gave us the information to contact Tracer Research. They were out of Tucson, Arizona. And Dave talked to them for a while and got the gist of what would be needed and what type of investment would be required to pull this all off. And came home and we talked about it. And I said, let's go, let's do it. So it was a big learning experience for both of us for the first year. And at that time, we were focusing on commercial tanks or regulated tanks, because at that time, there was a big push from the EPA and the DEP to have underground tanks removed, commercial tanks at the time, because they were at the 30-year mark. So there was billboards everywhere. There was billboards on the sides of buses. So in any case, we were doing a lot of that tank testing over the year, learning the Tracer Research method and how to do it. But we were focusing our work in Cape Cod. We worked with the Cape Cod Health Department. We worked with Otis Air Force Base. We did a lot of tank testing out there at Provincetown Airport. And then we were also venturing up into Vermont. And we were trying to navigate marketing and all this while still continuing our other businesses, our other jobs. But then in like 1996, the state of Connecticut, excuse me, not the state of Connecticut, there was an insurance program that was offered through your fuel oil dealer, where you could purchase an insurance policy for your underground oil tank. And in order to get that policy, you had to have a tank test done. And they had a couple of different methodologies that they used, but they really liked this tracer test. But the problem is the only other tracer affiliate in New England, other than us, was this big fuel oil company. And seeing that the fuel oil company had the testing program and the insurance program was offered through the fuel oil dealers, they didn't like the conflict of interest. So we were able to negotiate a deal, and we were able to get a license with Tracer to test in Connecticut, which is how we ended up getting into residential properties. So we did a ton of tank testing from like 1996 through like 1997, 98, the real estate market was kind of climbing, and this insurance program was very popular. And a lot of tanks were found to be leaking. So Dave and his good friend, who used to be the service manager, decided that they needed to form a company to remove tanks, remove all these leaking tanks that we found, and do remediation. So Dave and Ed formed a company called Absolute Tank Removal, and they became spill contractors for the state of Connecticut, and we started doing tank removals. And then over the years, we've gone into other different tank testing methodologies. Now we're using a test called the Horner Locator Plus. But what pushed us into the removal end also was, I don't know if any of you remember the Connecticut Amnesty Program, which was started in 1999. The General Assembly established a 2.5-year amnesty program for residential underground tanks. And that was to encourage homeowners to remove their oil tanks, underground oil tanks as well. And they had certain contractors that you could use to do these tank removals. And the state was then reimbursing homeowners the cost of cleanup if the tank was found to be leaking anywhere from like 30 to 70%. So it was very helpful for people to remove their tanks. Because everybody was scared that they were leaking and it's going to cost all this money. So the insurance company came through, and their amnesty program came through, and they were able to, Absolute Tank Removal business went through the roof, and a lot of underground tanks were removed during that program. So that's me, and that's how we got into absolute tank testing and absolute tank removal. And like I told everybody before, it's been a long, strange trip because we're still doing this. Dave and I are still together. Our little dream came true. We established our business and left Connecticut in 2008. And Dave retired, and I run the business from wherever we happen to be, which will share between Vermont and Cape Cod. So it's a little love story that came true, and we're back. We're still in business 28 years later. And still married.
Carrie, can I ask one question?
Sure.
Tank removal, residential versus commercial. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is the law changed where you don't have to remove a residential tank, a commercial buried tank? Is that true?
True. Well, I'll get into that a little bit later. So the residential tanks don't really have any regulations or laws that are imposed upon them by the state of Connecticut. So if you have an underground oil tank, it could stay there. What happens is if it is found to be leaking, then the state says, yes, you have to clean it up. So, and even in those particular cases, it depends on the extent of the cleanup or the contamination. If it's not affecting a third party or groundwater, it could stay there as long as the source of the contamination has been removed. But that's not always the best case because property transfers, you can't sell the house if that's the case. But if you intended on staying there forever and always, then hey, let your kids deal with it. That's what a lot of people have done, and I get a lot of calls like that. Oh, my parents died and they found a tank, and
that's why we're seeing these issues with some commercial gas stations, right? When they transfer the property or they turn it into residential property, and they find out there's a lot of contamination. It stayed on the property, but it was an issue.
Right. Commercial properties are a different story. If those are going to sell to anybody, those are regulated. They have to have phase 1 and phase 2 environmental surveys done before they can transfer that. And that's a whole nother process. So I'll get started here. So yeah, absolute tank testing was started in 1995. I already gave you that little bit of info. And there's my little mousey here. So just a little bit of oil heat history. Maybe you guys already know this, but oil heat's also referred to fuel oil or number two fuel. And this guy Fessler invented the first oil burner way back in 1903. And, I get a lot of questions about, oh, I'm buying a house that was built in the 20s. Do you think it could have had an underground oil tank? And I always say, yeah, it's very possible, because underground oil tanks or oil heat in general started becoming into play during the 20s and 30s. And right now in Connecticut, about 43% of homes are using oil heat and about 25% on natural gas. But how big is the problem? I mean, that's the question. Everybody's like, why are we so worried about underground tanks? And I'll let you look at this little information there and give you some other info here. But home heating oil is the most common grade of heating oil used for private residences. Some of the older mobile homes, I don't know if you guys do inspections on mobile homes, but some of the old mobile homes use kerosene. But in New England, it's super easy to use fuel oil. It's readily available. It's always been in a competitive market, and you can pretty much service any and all customers, no matter where they are, unlike natural gas. And it's relatively high energy content. It's about 139,000 BTUs per gallon, and compared with 91,300 for liquid propane and 135,000 for a gallon of kerosene. But in Connecticut, between January 2010 and September of 2019, there were reported 11,400 releases of heating oil, and over 78% of those were on private residences. So about 8,900 reports of a leak in a private residence. So, I mean, we all know that heating oil releases can potentially harm wildlife, pollute the soil, surface water, groundwater, and then groundwater contamination that can go super expensive to clean up. And about 1 million people in Connecticut rely on private or public wells for clean drinking water, and about 720,000 residents rely on private community wells. So there's a lot of impacts from a leaking tank that we can try to mitigate by trying to find them during your home inspections and so forth. Let's see. So back to Stan's question with regards to tanks being regulated or unregulated. Residential oil heating tanks are not subject or mandatory to registration, reporting, or inspection. That goes for above ground tanks or underground tanks. So a lot of people say, oh, well, there's the EPA rules say, and I'm like, well, the EPA is a federal organization, so we don't have to worry about the EPA. Let's just worry about what we have going on in your residential tank. And if we don't find anything bad, then that's good. We don't have to tell anybody. So I think you guys are probably also aware of the full disclosure laws in Connecticut for both commercial properties and residential properties, meaning if there is a known underground oil tank or was an underground oil tank of any kind, or a tank.
Carrie, speak a little closer.
It's got to be noted in their disclosure when they put the property to contract. So this is where we come into tank searches. We call this, when we go to look for a tank at a residential property, we refer to it as a tank search or a tank scan. And they're usually calling me a realtor or a homeowner or a buyer saying a home inspector just came and did a home inspection and there's reason to suspect an underground tank, or I'll get a call. I'm selling my parents' house and I remember as a kid there used to be an underground tank, but I don't have any idea. My parents have dementia. They don't know. I get all kinds of different calls about this type of stuff. But we come out, and this is my technician, Victor. He's been with me for 20 years, and he is using what's called a 2-box magnetometer, which is basically a heavy-duty metal detector. And he's the one and only technician that I have right now. But when it comes to real estate transactions, because we had all those tank removals back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, permits were pulled and paperwork was filed. So a lot of times, even though the state doesn't have records for residential tanks, it's good to look to the building department and or the fire marshal in the town. Sometimes they have records, but sometimes they don't keep them for very long. So each town is pretty different. But what the technician will do is, when the person calls, I ask a number of questions. And that is, how long have you owned the home? What is it heated with now? How long has it been heated with that? Do you have any additions or modifications to the original footprint? Is there any records on file anywhere? I get all this information, and I have a little form that I give my technician, and he'll head out to the field. And the first thing he'll do is ask to see the basement or the furnace area. And he'll go down into the furnace or room or the basement area or garage, and he's going to look for lines, piping, patching, tracking in the floor, foundation walls, petrometers, and see if there's any evidence on the inside. Then he'll head outside, and using this device that you see here, he scans from the foundation out roughly 30 feet around the perimeter of the current structure of the home. And this magnetometer, when you find something metal and large, it will make a very large sound. And he can distinguish between something smaller or something the size of a tank, because tanks have certain dimensions that he's looking for. So once he does that, he finds something, or if the metal detector does detect something, he'll double check and make sure that there's no underground utilities where he's at, and he'll use a small hand boring tool, and he'll tap down in the ground to see if he can find the depth to this mass or the positioning of this metal mass. Typically, your residential tanks are 550 gallons or 1,000 gallons. They both will measure 48 inches in diameter, and they're roughly 6 to 10 feet long. So he's looking for something fairly large, and it's usually set about 15 to 36 inches below grade. Some are a little deeper, some are a little shallower. Nothing is consistent in the residential property. All righty, so there's also another type of way to detect underground tanks, and that is ground penetrating radar. I have a subcontractor that I can use for this type of service, but I usually require or tell people to reserve this to a really large property, or if you're looking in a giant field or a big backyard. If you're looking for maybe where a barn was and it was knocked down and you want to see if there's any tanks, a ground penetrating radar is good with that application because it's a larger area. And the other difference with ground penetrating radar is that it can not only identify a tank, but it can identify any anomalies or the areas where the soil has been disturbed from a tank removal. So if people need that type of service, I do have a subcontractor that I use for that. So some signs that a property might have: an undisclosed or an unknown tank. A lot of tanks built prior to 1985 and that are now heated with natural gas. It's a good guess that they might have had oil previously, unless they're in a city. Copper lines protruding through the foundation wall, holes in the concrete, molding, tracking on the floor. Outside, there might be a vent pipe that's someplace on the side of the house that doesn't relate to anything, or there might be an indentation where a tank may have been removed or abandoned. So those are some of the things that you can look for. Or if the tank of the house has a natural gas now and there's an oil burner switch at the top of the stairs, there's a good indication that it had oil heat probably at one time. So I'm just going to show you guys a bunch of pictures. Unless you have any questions up until now, next few pictures are going to be just things that we've seen along the years looking for evidence of underground tanks or oil tanks in general. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah. Yes, I have a quick question. Why did we bury tanks? Why were the tanks buried? Why not leave them above ground? I mean, obviously the space in some houses, but was there any particular reasons why they buried them?
I think capacity wise, because the above ground tanks are smaller in capacity. It's got your 275s or 330s. So I think it's just larger capacity because fuel oil was fairly inexpensive up until recently. And it was easy to have access to. I mean, if you think about the New England coastline, there's so many tank farms, those ginormous tanks in Bridgeport and New Haven and up into Providence. There's tons of tanks farms because it's easy to get it to places. So I think it was just space and usage. I really don't know the true answer, but that's my guess.
Thank you.
You got it. So in this little picture here, we have the first one is a petrometer. I don't know if you guys have ever seen one of those. Those are pretty old, used back before the 90s. There's some oil lines that are coming in through a foundation wall. Those are nice. They're capped, hanging down there. And behind a furnace, I don't know if you could see the little circle, there's some cut oil lines back there. And in a crawl space, I mean, so many people have made modifications and changed their homes and put on additions. Sometimes there's a lot hiding in those little crawl spaces. And I know you guys got to get into those crawl spaces. I don't know how you do it. My technician's like 6'3", so getting into a crawl space is kind of hard. I just don't know how you guys get in there. I don't like spiders or anything, but
we send the bots in. No, I'm just kidding.
You just gotta suck it in. You suck it in.
Right. So this is another indication of an oil tank that was abandoned. That little patch in the driveway. The tank has natural gas now, and the home inspector actually said that there was no evidence on the inside to say that there was an underground oil tank. We did not get a chance to get into this house, but just using the magnetometer scan around the house, the technician found this little spot here, and it did end up being a tank. And it was filled with sand when they did the actual removal itself, because the buyer still didn't want it there. They wanted to have the tank removed and had soil samples and want the paperwork to follow that up. This is another little basement. Broad look is the first one. There's a cut oil line by the furnace. And then underneath this little carpet along my little red line, there's a track in the floor. And it goes from the furnace across to an exterior foundation wall and goes underneath the little hot water heater there. But above the hot water heater is two little oil lines sticking out. And lo and behold, outside. So if the first picture, just beyond the hot water tank is their above ground tank. And you can see in the last picture, the fill and vent pipe up against the house, and then a little outline in white. There's actually an underground tank there. Let's see.
Carrie, is it true? I heard like a myth that if you see those lines coming through the cement wall and they're crimped up and folded up, that's sort of telling you that the tank's been removed.
They can be crimped, they can be capped, they can be cut flush in the wall. Let's see if I can go
But
back.
just because they are, it doesn't mean that the tank's been removed.
Correct, exactly. So in this particular instance, see in above the hot water heater, those are just cut. I think there's maybe a fitting on there,
Right.
on those two lines, and that's it. So when we went outside, and Victor went outside to do the scan, right in alignment with the vent and fill pipe for the above ground tank inside was the outside tank. So they had never taken care of, or they might have taken care of it. Excuse me. It could be that. So in this particular case, this underground tank that he found, there's no fill and vent pipe for that tank. It's been disconnected, or maybe it's below grade someplace. So it's a good guess that it may have been abandoned in place whenever. I don't know remember all the details, but like Stan had said earlier that he had a tank abandoned in place because it was underneath a deck. So what they do in an abandonment is they just uncover the top of the tank, remove all the oil and so forth in it, wash it out, and they take some soil samples to make sure there's no contamination. And then some companies use sand. Absolute Tank Removal, I believe, uses an expandable foam, and then they just cover it back up and everything's done. But I've also been to places where they left the fill pipe, or they left the vent pipe against the side of the house. They didn't take that, but there's no way to get into the tank itself. So unfortunately, when I'm doing that for a potential buyer of a property and we do find a tank like this, we don't know if it was abandoned properly because there's no documentation or paperwork. So they got to go back to your lawyers and figure out what you want to do. We can do soil samples around the perimeter of it, but quite honestly, I always recommend that they uncover the tank or remove the tank. If it's in a difficult location, you can't always remove the tank, but you can have extra soil samples done.
Okay.
I had one that was actually buried. They put an addition on, and there was, it was like in the slab, and they actually just built over it. There's nothing you could do. It is what it is, right? On that.
Exactly. It is what it is.
And you hope that nothing leaked or there had any issues prior to that.
Yeah.
But that was an
And
interesting.
I've had some people be like, oh, well, can you come out and do soil samples around the perimeter of the addition where the oil tank was underneath? And I'm like, you're wasting your money, because there's really no way I know where the oil tank was underneath this addition. So you were just doing random soil samples, and it's a waste of money. As much as I would like to. Go ahead.
Do you ever drill through the tank and check just underneath the tank?
When they do a true abandonment, when the tank's uncovered and they open up the tank itself, yes, they punch a hole through the bottom and they take a soil sample from beneath the tank. Once the oil's been removed, and then they also wash it out and they suck out that wash water, wastewater, they suck that out. That's when they'll punch a hole through the bottom to do the actual soil sample for the abandonment. All right, so this was a really hard one. That the owner said that I had an underground tank and we had it removed, but I can't find any of my paperwork, and we want soil samples where the tank used to be. I know it was in the front of my house. So that's all great that a homeowner is telling me that, but when I'm writing a report, I kind of have to prove that the homeowner is correct. Otherwise, it's hearsay. The homeowner said it was located here. So what we try to do is confirm that by going inside and finding where those oil lines actually exit the building or the house. So this is kind of hard, and I'm sure you guys can all attest to this. Doing a home inspection in some people's basement or wherever is like atrocious. There's so many personal belongings. You can't see anything. So this is his garage, and they said the tank was in the front of the house and by the fill and vent pipe for the other tank. So he had to dig his way in through this garage, and it was underneath the shelving unit way in the back corner. And you can see there's a blue line, which is EnviroFlex, which is for the current oil tank going into the furnace. And then right next to it are two or maybe a single clipped copper line that actually exits to the front of the house. So in this particular instance, they wanted soil testing done. So we guesstimate the approximate location of the former tank, and that's just based on prior experience working in the field. Or sometimes there's an indentation or some type of evidence, but I'll get to soil samples in just a little bit. Just another instance where there was some new tank, oil lines, nobody knew anything. There's some pipe sticking up in the yard, but I don't know. We can't get the cap off. So another thing that we look at sometimes is there's placards on the newer tanks that show the date of manufacture. So in this particular case, it was manufactured in 2004. So it's a good guess that the underground oil tank that was previously there was taken out of service right around that time. All righty. And this is evidence of an above ground tank in a basement. They had originally called us because they found some oil lines down in a track next to the furnace, even though it was gas. And I don't know if you can see my little green mark. There's some copper lines sticking out of a concrete track against the floor. And they run all the way along the wall. And then to this corner, and you could see the outline where they painted around the tank. And then the technician also noticed, if you see in the upper pictures, where the fill and vent pipe for the above ground tank used to exit the house. But on the other side of that is an addition. So they just wanted to make sure there was no underground tank. And I'm like, it looks pretty much like it was an above ground tank there.
Carrie, would you say it's safe to, we see a lot of old tanks, obviously the newer tanks have handles on it. If we see a very old tank, house is built, say, in the 50s or 40s, and you see a very old tank, 50-year-old, 40-year-old tank. Have you ever seen where there was an old tank, 40, 50 years old, and maybe the house, like my house, 1920s, where there, prior to them putting one in the basement, that old tank, there was one buried outside? Have you seen that, or is it rare? Where we've had, originally buried it for 10 or 20 years and still there, and then they put one inside. But the tank inside is old too. Might be 30, 40, 50 years old.
Yes, we do. And I've seen many instances of that over the years. And I think it's simply because of our aging population and people not knowing what was going on. And it wasn't really a big deal before the mid 90s. Residential underground tanks weren't a big deal. Nobody really cared about them. Until radon. When did radon become a big problem? Until it became a big problem. So I think that the underground tanks in the area just have been there for the old timers. And I know that there's a lot of farms in New England and in Connecticut too that we've been to that have not only had underground oil tanks for the homes when they started doing the coal to oil conversion, they also had gasoline tanks, leaded gasoline tanks for farm equipment, or when it was using gasoline, or diesel tanks for farm equipment. And they were next to the barn with a pump. And now the barn, the property's changed hands, the barn's gone. And when they start doing construction, they find a tank. So it's definitely possible to have a tank that's nobody knows anything about. So I get back to crawl spaces, more crawl spaces and oil lines. This one, they just cut the oil line and left all these fittings on there and just let it hang out. And this is another property where we have oil lines exiting an exterior foundation wall, and we were doing soil samples out there. So they didn't know they had a tank, even though there's a fill pipe here and a big vent pipe over here. I don't know why they didn't know.
Hey, Carrie, I want to just jump in for 1 second and ask Stan or Scott a question. I know Stan's been inspecting for a long time. He may have even done the very first inspection. In our state standard, it says that we're not required to inspect underground items, including storage tanks and such. And I want to know from even anybody who's listening, have you ever run into a situation where you've done an inspection like this? Maybe there are lines coming out and you missed it. Is it, what's the liability on that if a client comes back to you? Maybe Scott can comment on it. I mean,
well, here's my feeling. Like Jim, there's a lot of stuff in the standards that I mean, if you don't, there's guys that miss mold, and we're not required to do mold, and you clearly go up in the attic, you see it. The question is, maybe after you spend thousands and thousands of dollars to defend yourself, you might be right, but you're still going to have to pay money.
You'll have to fight for your life, Jim.
Yes.
okay.
And even though stuff that's visible, readily accessible, you can make that argument. Well, if you take 4 screws off or 6 screws off the electrical panel to open it up to see the inside of the panel, why didn't you unscrew that hatch that was covering the crawl space? You get in to find that there's termite and then there's mold and all that other stuff too. So, you just got to document. You did the best you could. If you missed it and you did the best you could and you missed it, well,
But if you tripped over it and didn't write it up,
correct.
Then you got a
You have
problem.
a problem either way. Even though the state standard says you're not required to, you could still have an issue. I mean, you can have an issue with anything, but it is underground. And like Carrie said, you walk into some of these basements and crawl spaces, there's so much storage. Those 2 little copper lines are so easy to miss at times.
Well,
So, that's why now with cameras and stuff, you take a picture of all the clutter in a basement, all the things that will restrict your inspection, you got a better chance at defending yourself. But back in the day, before we were taking pictures, it was, you couldn't, even if it was hidden, it was hard to prove.
Okay.
Back in the days
Cool,
of the
Craig.
caves for the dinosaurs.
Thanks. Carrie, continue.
Sorry,
And
Gary.
on that same note, I have to say that we have missed some tanks. We have missed locating some tanks. Victor does a great job. And I think over the 20 years that he's worked for us, I think he's only missed about 6 or maybe 7 tanks. And we do hundreds of these a year. And the ones that he did miss, there were some, and like Stan said, thank gosh we have photographic stuff right now. The most recent ones are easy to do, but when we use a metal detector. So if there is a dumpster in the driveway or the yard because they're chucking stuff, they're selling their house, that will set the metal detector off like crazy. A lot of these new homes have, or these remodels have these beautiful patios that have rebar reinforcement underneath them. Rebar is steel. So if he scans over a patio that has rebar underneath it, that completely throws the whole thing. So that's kind of where ground penetrating radar might come in as a secondary, because it can decipher through that steel that's setting off the metal detector. So, thank gosh we have some pictures that we can prove to people that there's all kinds of junk in their basement and clutter and personal belongings, and we just couldn't see it. So we have missed a few, but not too many. This is just another example of a track in the floor leading from the furnace over to an exterior wall. Also a cut oil line or a patch next to a gas-fired furnace. All pretty much evidence. Again, more oil lines. These ones are capped and they let out to an underground tank. This underground tank was a 275-gallon tank. So I think I talked about the size of tanks that are used in residential applications. 275s and 330s are meant for above ground purposes only. They're made of a different gauge steel than say a 550 or 1,000-gallon tank for underground purposes. But back in the 60s and 70s, where everything was so cheap, they were being cheap, they put in the smaller tanks and they all had problems. Every small tank, 275 or 330 that we tested was leaking. This is a super old house, obviously with the stone foundation. There was, again, gas, heat, and there's a track in the floor, and then just a small, tiny clipped oil line, and a little concrete track along the floor. And then just above that was, you can barely see it, it's just cut and crimped and folded over. And then outside there was a vent pipe still left over, and the fill pipe had been below grade. So Victor found the tank with the metal detector and then hand dug down and found that fill pipe and was able to get into the tank. It still had oil in it. It was not a good thing. This was just evidence of an above ground tank. And I forgot to mention that when I say AST, it's an above ground storage tank, or UST is underground storage tank. So in this picture, we just have, there's a patch in the wall. And if you notice, there's a window there, it's above grade. And there was two patches. There was an oil line patch, and there was an actual 2-inch holes that had been painted over and concreted over. And we determined that was from an above ground oil tank. There's some spotting on the floor from the legs and the fill and vent pipe holes going outside. We determined that it was either an above ground tank inside or an above ground tank outside. This is another tank we found. It's kind of weird color floor, but it's gas fired furnace, and there's all kinds of oil staining on the floor next to it. And there's this little bump, which is the track for an oil line. There used to be an oil fired furnace there. That oil line goes underneath that track and beneath the floor. And then over in the corner, there were 2 holes in the wall, just clipped. And he went outside. This is the 2 holes. So again, Jim, you were saying, are they always crimped or bent over, or sometimes they're just cut against the wall, or there's just 2 holes that are left from where they pulled the oil line out. But he found a tank. It was 1,000-gallon. That was a property in New Haven. They have not removed it yet, but they will be. So again, I don't know if the tank was filled with sand or foam, or if there's oil in it. So that's always my recommendation, is for either further investigation or removal. And this is another one that I'm sure you guys might have come across when people have finished basements. So in this particular basement, we came in through the garage into a furnace room, and then we went into a finished area, like a family room, and then on the other side of the family room was more storage and 2 above ground tanks. So the technician saw the 2 above ground tanks, came over to this burner area, and he was able to get behind the subwall to the addition, or for the family room, and you can see the oil line on the floor. And then way in the back, there's 2 oil lines that exit the back of the house, the exterior foundation wall. So even behind subwalls, the oil lines can get hidden. So I always try to tell my technician to make sure that if there is a finished area, we can't always see the exterior foundations walls when we have a finished basement. But if you can look behind some foundation or a subwall, it's a good idea too, just because there's sometimes things that are hiding back there that they don't know about either. Petrometers. Everybody ever come across a petrometer in their home inspections? These are super old way for people to keep track of the fuel oil in their underground oil tank. There's a lot of old homes in New Haven have these, especially, and Bridgeport. And this is evidence of a previous above ground tank. They had a tank in the basement and patched over behind the air compressor for their air conditioning unit are 2 2-inch holes, which are from a previous above ground tank. So that brings us to soil samples. Does anybody have any questions on tank searches? No?
No?
Okay. So
Yeah, we do have one question.
Sure.
In-ground oil tanks required to have 2 lines?
Yes, used to, yes, now no. I think now you can have a single line system. Before it was a return and a feed line. I don't know all the details of installing a tank, so I'm not sure exactly what the requirements are because that's not my specialty.
Okay, thank you.
I can find the answer out for you though.
Well, we can do that.
So sometimes people want to do soil samples either on an existing tank or what we call a tank grave, or where a tank used to be located. We do soil samples by means of hand borings, which means the technician uses a giant drill to start the hole, and then we try to get down to say 6 to 8 feet below grade, and that's all done by hand. It's more cost effective for people to do it that way, but the one thing is we can't get deeper than say 8 feet by hand borings. So when you were working with a site that we know maybe had some previous contamination or may have had a cleanup done, and they just want to see if there's contamination still remaining, I may suggest using what's called a geoprobe, which is a push-mounted drill rig. It's a lot more expensive than a regular standard soil samples, but it will go as deep as say 12 to 15 feet below grade, and that can also collect groundwater samples. So I don't have a lot of use for that right now. For some of the bigger properties, or for a commercial property, you'd want to have a geoprobe do your soil samples because again, they can get down to the groundwater and fairly deep. But the technician, when he's doing a soil sample around an existing tank, he'll stick the tank to determine what the depth to the bottom is. And that's how he will determine how deep he needs to get to his tank. If there's no access into the tank, he'll use a probe to see how deep the top of the tank is, and then just add the 48 inches, which is the diameter of your residential tank. And then he collects the samples. We typically take 4 samples. We combine them into one composite sample, and that goes off to a state certified lab for analysis for extractable total petroleum hydrocarbons. So that's part of the residential services that we do on a regular basis. No longer, here's some pictures of some soil samples that were done on a existing underground tank. Both of those, there's 2 tanks there. So we'll just take 4 samples and that's what goes to the lab. And this was a tank grave. We found some oil lines in the crawl space above that tank. It was underneath an addition, and this was outside the addition. So we suspect that the previous oil tank was located there based on the oil lines, and we just took some soil samples in that area. Do you guys want me to get into tank testing? Do you guys have any need for that?
Yeah, you can absolutely.
Okay, so we used to do that tracer tight tank test. That takes a long time to do. It takes roughly 10 days to 2 weeks to get the results back from the tracer type test. And the other reason why we don't do it anymore is Tracer Research sold their tracer tight tank test technology to Praxair Services, and Praxair did not want to support any of the individual affiliates that were located around the country. So we stopped using the tracer test probably back in the early 2000s. But we also used another type of test called the Alert 1000 for a little bit. And then we came across this test called the Horner Easy 3 Locator Plus, which is a super easy test. It's quick. The timing on that for either a commercial tank or a residential tank is roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours. When you do a tank tightness test, it tests the integrity of the tank, the associated lines and piping, and this is done with an acoustic-based, non-volumetric tank testing system. So the technician on a residential property will go in and turn the furnace off, turn the switch off. The tank is then isolated, the vent cap is plugged, and the equipment for testing is put into the tank. He'll take measurements of the product level. He'll check to see if the tank has any water. He'll check for groundwater. And then there's a certain mathematical equation that's made to determine how much negative pressure or vacuum is applied to the tank. So the tank is put into a vacuum, and then once it's reached to the approximate levels, he'll watch a physical monitor as well as a listen with an acoustical component to listen for any signals that are being given. If the tank is providing a leak, whether it's in the empty space, it'll give you a hiss. If it's in the wetted portion of the tank where the oil is, you'll hear a little bubble. So we do a lot of these on commercial tanks in the state of Connecticut. They're required on a regular basis, whether it's depending on the type of tank that it is. A lot of insurance companies for regulated tanks require testing on an annual basis as well. And we test both fuel oil tanks and gasoline and diesel.
Carrie, is there a lot of times we have a question from a member? Is there good testing to determine condition of older above ground oil tanks? And we see a lot of rust and corrosion on tanks. And I've seen actually stickers on above ground tanks that certify it and all that. Do you guys test those, or is there a company that you know of? And I mean, is there other than
there is a program, and I don't know who offers it anymore. We do not. They do steel thickness testing on residential above ground tanks. Or they do it on commercial tanks too, but on residential tanks, I think some fuel oil dealers might have the service, and they just come in and they do just a steel thickness test along the bottoms and along the sides. But it's sometimes pretty obvious to see when an above ground tank is starting to go. I mean, there's all kinds of fuel oil leaking in the fittings at the top, and there's a lot of rust and corrosion. And obviously, if there's a tank that's not well supported on 4 legs that are not corroded, then there's a potential to have problems there. Definitely don't want to see an above ground tank sitting on a dirt basement floor or on concrete blocks. You definitely want to have 4 sturdy legs on that. And same thing with an underground tank. The average life expectancy is 25 to 30 years. Above ground tanks, they can sometimes go to 40, but it's pushing it depending on the conditions in your basement. Most are wet, so it definitely contributes to the corrosion. And the same thing with an underground tank in a residential situation. If you have a lot of groundwater, that's going to cause the tank to corrode more quickly than if it were in a nice dry spot, that was installed with the sand and crushed stone. I have a lot of tanks that are underneath structures and are perfectly fine. I've seen tanks that are 60 years old and pulled that look beautiful. And I've seen tanks that are 15 years old that look like Swiss cheese. Electricity, believe it or not, plays a big factor in the corrosion of steel tanks. And I can get into that later because we also do cathodic protection testing, or we don't have time, but so yeah, like a lot of people had these beautiful walkways with these nice lights, but the electricity from the lights caused the corrosion over the top of the tank. So there's some things that people look for. So yeah, this is my technician again. This is a commercial property. He's just getting ready to prepare a tank test. This is the tank testing equipment. The cathodic protection testing is some tanks, some commercial tanks, and even some residential tanks called STIP 3s have what's called cathodic protection. And that's just a way to help redirect the flow of electricity away from the tank into these anodes that are put onto the tank itself when it's installed. And they get tested on a regular basis as well to make sure that those anodes are working properly. So even though the Connecticut DEP doesn't have any jurisdictions, laws, or rules about residential underground tanks in general, if they're found to be leaking, look out. They will definitely look to.
Carrie, a little closer.
You have to report that to the state if you find any type of leaks, or whether it's on the surface water, drinking well. Do any of you guys do water testing?
Yeah.
We do.
Your home inspection? So I don't think in a regular water test, they test for petroleum hydrocarbons.
No.
So if you suspect there might have been an underground tank there, that might be another option to check the well water, if it's got well water, to have the water tested for ETPH, or extractable total petroleum hydrocarbons. Alrighty, so we'll get going towards the end here. This is a picture of a tank removal, a leaking tank, unfortunately. So as you can see, the tanks are usually pretty close to the house, when they're usually within 5 to 10 feet. This one, excuse me, looks like a 1,000-gallon tank. But what they do is they come in, they uncover the top of the tank, they cut a hole in the top of the tank so they can remove all the oil, and they clean it out. And once they do that, they can pop the tank up out of the ground. And I don't know if you guys can see in your picture here, you can see the gray, the dark gray sheen down in the water, down the bottom of the hole. So that was a leaking tank. And that's a little bit closer at the contamination there. And even though the tank removal and installation part isn't something that I handle on a regular basis, I'm still in communication with Absolute Tank Removal. So I asked them to give me an update. I don't know if anybody's interested. Tank removals these days for 1,000-gallon or 550. Sight unseen, they're looking at 2,000 to 2,500 to remove a underground oil tank that's either a 550 or 1,000. That's a broad estimate, but that does also would include soil permits and soil analysis. A remediation or a cleanup, that's where it can get pretty costly. The minimum is usually a 22 tons, which is one triaxle full of contamination, and that is going to start you at about 12,500. And that can go on up. So two trucks were on up to $20,000, and that's just for doing the cleanup part. And that you have to bring back in material to fill the hole back in, so it can get pretty expensive. So it's pretty important to try and see if we can locate these underground tanks when we're doing our inspections. And I think that's all I had, unless anybody has any questions.
Can you still bury a tank?
I think it goes town to town, and I think that if you or if they're going to allow tanks to be put back in the ground, that they go with either a fiberglass tank or a double wall tank, or a tank that comes with cathodic protection. I have an underground oil tank myself, and it does have cathodic protection on it, and it was installed very well with unlike a lot of residential properties where they just backfill the hole with whatever's left over from debris from the building site. We actually used sand and pea stone, and it's very aerated. It's also covered. We don't have a high groundwater table, and we have the cathodic protection tested on a regular basis.
Carrie, do you deal with in-ground propane tanks?
Not as far as doing tightness testing on them, but I think I do know that some underground propane tanks also have cathodic protection. And that can be tested to see if it's working or if it's even there. So I think that's a new thing coming into play, if I recall correctly, because it's a new field. I've had a couple of questions for people fielded from people about doing cathodic protection testing on underground propane tanks. And I think it's going to be something that's going to be up and coming.
In general, what is your fee? I know we're getting to 8 o'clock. What is your fee ballpark? Depends on the size of the house and everything. You know, if you give us a ballpark, if we bring you in, and I have had Victor come out and do some,
So for a tank search or for a tank scan, just to see if there's an underground tank, that's going to run $325 to $350. That's based in my local Connecticut area. If I go into New York, I go into Westchester County, it's a little bit more. Soil sampling starts at $450. There's some sites before we can do soil sampling. If the property is on natural gas, I definitely need to call before you dig. The site needs to be marked, and I would need to get a dig number just to make sure they mark the gas line so there's no accidents. So that starts at $450. Tank testing starts at $400. And whatever other services, tank removals, I think I just gave you all that information. Tank installation, like if you wanted a tank in a basement, I think Absolute Tank Removal is charging roughly $500 to $800. And then there's they have to cut the tank to get it out of the basement, so there's a charge per cut, and then there's a liquid disposal charge, so there's a little bit extras there.
So you will install a 275 gallon tank, a 330 tank, new in a basement. Do you guys do that?
Yes, that's about the 500 to 800. Oh no, that's in the removal.
I was going to say you could do mine tomorrow if that's what it's going to cost. I thought those were around like $2,000, $2,500.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably roughly the same or close to what a underground tank removal is. The 2,000 mark. I did not ask that question. I can get that info for you. Yeah, but it's about the same.
Okay. All right.
Maybe a little less. Maybe 1,500 to 2,000. I can ask Eddie and let you know. Okay. And then for Absolute, so I cover all of Connecticut. Absolute Tank Removal has a smaller coverage area, simply because they have to travel with big equipment, the vac truck and excavators and so forth. So I think that Eddie and Absolute Tank Removal are covering, I know, Fairfield County and New Haven County, and I think the outskirts of the shoreline area, and maybe up into the southern parts of Hartford. I don't know that they go all over. I know they don't go all the way over up to like northern Connecticut or up to Storrs area or Hartford. I don't think they go into Hartford. It's just too far.
I think Eddie does have a guy he knows up that way. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I'm sure they know somebody up that way. So if you called them, you should be able to reach them, and they can give you an idea of who can help you out.
And Ed's gonna come in too. Actually, Jack will be coming in first of the year to talk about actually how the removal process. So this is good to have you here about the testing, and then hopefully get them guys out there to talk about the removal.
Jack, I've known Jack a long time too. He's one of our original employees for Absolute Tank Removal because he used to work with Eddie.
Yeah, he's done a presentation for us in the past. He was very good. And thank you so much, Carrie. You did a great job.
Got it.
Thank you, Carrie.
Again.
Informative.
Yes,
and I appreciate you taking the time out to talk to our members.
You got it. And if any of you guys, go ahead.
If you find an oil tank is leaking inside, do you have to report that to the DEP?
As long as it's contained and it hasn't like gotten into the sump pump or anything like that.
Yep.
We've had some situations a long time ago where the oil line ran underneath the basement floor and you couldn't see it, but they were having oil show up in their sump pump and outside, and it was quite a mess. But in that particular situation, yes. But
Thank you.
as long as it's contained and there's certain things you can use to try to clean up the oil. And you can call Absolute Tank Removal too if there's like a smell or an odor for something for an above ground tank. They can help take care of that as well.
Well, thank you very much, Carrie. This was extremely educational, and we'd love to have you back. But this was great. Thank you very much.
All right, you guys, thanks for having me on. Nice meeting you guys. And if you ever need anything, give me a holler.
Merry Christmas.